Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Myers. As all of you know, I'm a former seminarian with a master's in theology who now works as a tax accountant, and I'm here with my friend Rhys.
What's up, guys? Rhys Gadbois here, high school theology teacher. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in theological studies. And yeah, this is Of Mountains and Men.
Absolutely. And today we're going to talk about the concept of community. So we're going to give a little bit of a definition of what we think of as community, what a good community really is, based on Aristotle and some other concepts of friendship and community. And we're going to just, dive into that a little deeper in this episode.
Yeah, it'll be fun to talk about the concept of community, especially when it feels like in today's world, we all live really close to one another, but we don't want to.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking about this with my girlfriend the other day about the concept of the suburbs, that the suburbs is something that...
Disgusting.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we both feel that way. It's just like the suburbs to me is the epitome of, not to start with the via negativa, the way of the negative, the bad example, but the suburbs to me is a great example of the opposite of what true community is supposed to be in a certain sense, because there's so many suburban places now, especially subdivisions, where you have all these homes that are crammed really close together with each other. And they're just far enough away from a city oftentimes that you can't really walk most places. You're kind of forced to drive, but then no one really knows their neighbors in a lot of cases. Or if you do, you kind of barely know your neighbors. You might interact with them, say hi now and then, but there's not this sense of community, of actually getting together with your neighbors, of being part of the same community joined together. And I think that's just a great example of, kind of the sad reality that we live in a lot of the time in our world today. And so, we can talk about the more positive side of what I think real community, what good community really is. But
also another negative of the suburbs, DUIs. That's what I thought of. Obviously.
Yeah.
Obviously, you should not drink and drive. But when you were people used to be able to walk to and from where they wanted to go.
Yeah.
And yeah, that makes sense. But with the suburbs, that's just not really happening.
Yeah, that's a great point. That if you're, whether you're drinking at a friend's house or at the village pub or whatever, in the old days, oftentimes you would just walk from one place to the other. And so at least, not that obviously as a Catholic, I would never condone getting drunk, period. But a DUI, to your point, like that, you don't have to be drunk to be driving under the influence.
No.
And I think that's a thing that happens a little far too much nowadays. It's really sad to me how many people I've known personally or heard about who end up with DUIs, and it's an unwise, it's unsafe, it's dangerous for everyone. I think it's so much, to your point, it's so much better to be able to walk where you're going.
Yeah.
In those situations.
Also just healthier.
Yeah.
A lot healthier. A lot of people just getting their steps in. Now we have a Fitbit and we have to make a game out of how many steps I get in a day to be healthy.
Yeah, I have a Fitbit on my wrist right now. So yeah, exactly.
I had a Fitbit for a while and I just got lazy with charging it. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But how have you been lately, man? How are things?
Dude, good, but it's been crazy. I just moved. So we're recording this in late December, and I just moved to Towson, Maryland. So I just moved to a new apartment here, and that's been really awesome. It's a really nice place. I was living with my parents after getting out of seminary a year and a half ago. And so I'm now in this new apartment with a really nice den for working, because I work from home a lot of the time and things like that. But the move was just a crazy experience because it was the weekend of my girlfriend's birthday. So Friday we moved some stuff and then took her out to dinner for a special birthday dinner. And then Saturday moved some more stuff in the morning and had Handel's Messiah, the beautiful Christmas concert at the Basilica.
Was it good?
It was incredible. And honestly, they're going to do it next year at the Basilica too, from what I heard.
Okay.
And I will tell you, I've gone to it at the BSO, the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, for the last several years, and it's always beautiful. I love Handel's Messiah, but I think this year it was even more special because it was at the Basilica. That being at a really beautiful church as the venue rather than just a concert hall. There were two things I noticed. One was that the acoustics were actually almost a little better than the BSO, partially in the sense that the soloists in the past, it's been hard for me to understand what they're saying. That they're singing very operatically and it's beautiful, but it's hard to understand the words. the Basilica, like it was more clear. Like it was actually easier to understand the words they were singing, which was really beautiful. And then the other thing for me that I noticed was like the last piece in Handel's Messiah is this piece from the Book of Revelations about the Lamb of God, and it's kind of like taught in a sense. It's almost like they're singing about the Mass and like the the beauty of Revelation, and it's just that happening in the Basilica in a church where Mass is celebrated regularly just really brought to me like it really like brought home the just incredible sense of like heaven, like the sense of this is like what heaven is. So it was just really spectacular to me.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so that was really cool. And then Sunday moved some more stuff during the day, and ended up and then went to lessons and carols at the cathedral. So it happened to be like the worst weekend in the sense of like all these awesome things that I wanted to do for the like Advent Christmas time, but like not the best weekend to move at the same time. And then the other like funny part about it to me is the harrowing story of, so I had this really big new sectional couch, which we're right nearby. We're sitting at the table near it. And
I just realized you're about to describe carrying that up the steps.
Exactly.
And I just walked up those steps, and those are like thin, like when it comes to
and
space.
if you think about the angles, so this one piece of it right here, there's a really big piece of it, everyone, that's like, I think it's it was like 99 inches or something like that. So that's what, like 10 feet or something like that, whatever it is. It's like, it's a really long piece of it, and it's not, you can't break that piece up because it's one piece.
Gosh.
And the way that the stairs are in this apartment building that I'm living in, there's like a pretty sharp turn and not a lot of space, and the ceiling itself is 98 inches, so you can't just stand it straight up.
It's gotta be at an angle.
So first, on Friday, I had a friend of mine, Rob.
Shout out to Rob.
Yeah, exactly. Rob's a great guy. He's lives up by Rhys, actually. Runs like a men's group and everything up there. Mm-hmm. So Rob, with his pickup truck, had brought the couch down. That's where I'd had it stored for a little while at his house. And so it's just Rob and I on Friday trying to get this couch up the stairs. And we got the first two pieces without too much difficulty. And then we tried the big piece, and we're like, this is not working. So literally Friday night, I had to just leave it in the hallway of the apartment building.
Oh, dang.
Outside, and put a sign on it that was like, sorry, got stuck trying to move this. Like, I'll come back tomorrow with more people.
That's freaky.
So then I called in a couple other guys, Deacon Zach Watson, who's a friend of mine.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, and another guy, Brad, from our men's group up there.
Bradford.
Yeah.
I know his name's not Bradford, right?
No, it's actually Bradley, but it's fun.
Like we said, I'm going to keep
we
calling
should call
him
Bradford, yeah.
Until he corrects us.
I'm sure we'll have him on the podcast at some point.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, so Brad and Zach and Rob and I tackled it on Saturday morning, and we literally tried. Well, we tried a lot of things. I'm not going to say one of them on the podcast because I don't, in case for some reason somebody in the apartment complex ever heard about it, that would probably not be good. But let's just say we tried something that I'll tell you afterward. Let's just say we tried something that would probably have been frowned upon by the apartment complex, but it turned out it didn't work anyway. So we weren't able to do that. So then we figured out the only way we were going to be able to do this was if we could get one of the people on the landing on the second floor to open their door and let us like back it in their doorway and then go back up the stairs.
Nice.
And so like we were desperate. So I just knocked on, and I thought I'd heard a kid in this like apartment.
I heard
so
a kid walking up. Yeah, there's definitely.
So I knocked on this. Yeah, exactly. So I knocked on this door, and thankfully the woman was so gracious. She was like before I even really said anything, I think she had probably heard us through the door talking, and she was like, "Oh, you need to try through our door? Okay, that's fine. Yeah." So like she like let us do that, and like it was still really tight, but we just barely managed to get it to squeeze through the doorway and then back up the stairs. And so we got it up here, and then Zach, when we finally got it in here, well, and then turning the corner into the apartment here, there's like a sharp turn.
Yeah.
And so we had to do that. That was a whole nother thing. And then we finally got it in here, and Zach's like, Peter, you're never allowed to move from here.
Well, moving
after we just did this, like
moving is awful. I think moving is one of the consequences of original sin. It's just we're meant to stay in one place. Only our children are meant to expand. But after I've moved 5 times.
Mm-hmm.
I can't really remember exactly how many times I've moved over the past 5 years, and I hate it every time because you have to do stuff like this, like furniture. I had a buddy my cousin actually, when he was living in Portland and he just moved to Iowa. The dude who bought his place in Portland gave him an extra 10 grand just to leave his furniture.
Oh my gosh, really?
Which, like, if you got the money, by all means.
Yeah, I mean,
if it's good enough furniture, I don't want to move it. Just leave the stuff in your house, and
heck yeah,
we'll call it good. Oh, that'd be sweet. Well, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think actually to your point, like that's a great example of like what we're going to talk about today. In some ways, you know, even though you're joking in a sense, like it is interesting the concept of how moving. I think moving is one of the things that disrupts this sense of community nowadays too. Is how much people move. Like there's so many people in our age group, like a lot of young people, just move so much, and it you know when you think about it, part of community is building those roots and those friendships and having people nearby. And so like that's an interesting point, I think, that we'll get into probably. But
yeah, we'll have to dissect that a bit more, definitely, because I hate moving and I would love to crap on it some more.
But yeah, so I moved in. So how are you doing? How's
wait,
life?
Before we get to me, I want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
And if you don't like this, I apologize. But you're legally blind.
Mm-hmm.
How is it living on your own? Have you ever lived entirely on your own?
I did on little, like on for short periods. Like when I was in seminary, there was a rectory that I would stay in a lot. That didn't actually have any priests living there at the time because of the situation. Okay. And so like I would be there on my own sometimes for like a few weeks at a time. So I have lived on my own, although it was a parish that was still like active. So there was a permanent deacon and some other people who would come to the parish on a regular basis.
Okay.
Yeah.
How is it? But it's been a while. So how is it being on your own entirely again? Is it just like, oh, this is what it is?
I mean, it's been interesting, definitely. It's different. Like I kind of like it in some ways. Like obviously I wouldn't want to, well, personally I wouldn't want to live on my own for the rest of my life. Like
Right.
I don't feel called to that.
I don't think you're a good looking guy, Peter. I don't think that'll happen. Okay.
Well, yeah, exactly. I want to get married at some point, but yeah, like for right now, it's actually really nice because I was just living with my parents and one of my brothers, and I love my parents dearly. And I'm really grateful for the time that I had to be able to transition out of seminary and be at home and everything. But it definitely has been really nice to kind of have space that's my own. Like when I was like, it's really funny because the den, and this is not a knock to my parents. This is just, they retired into a small house a couple years ago. They were never expecting me to live with them. So this is not their fault at all. But it was just really funny because the den that I have now in this apartment where my office is roughly the size of the room that I was living in at my parents' house, where I had my bed and my desk for work and everything. So like, it's just like, it's crazy to now have like a space that is just my office versus all the way across the apartment is like my big bedroom with all, you know, like, so it's just nice to kind of have that space on my own. And
like
a
small commute to work, apparently. No.
Yeah, exactly. I have to actually walk across the hall instead of getting out of bed now.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So that's nice. And it's just nice to like, I haven't done it much yet, but it's nice to think about like making more meals and stuff. Like even 2 nights ago, I think it was, my girlfriend and I made like my first like kind of official like dinner meal here. And it was just so nice to have like my own cookware and everything, which I just got, and to just be like, I'm just going to throw something together. And like, that's just going to be like dinner tonight. Like it was so nice. That's something I'm looking forward to a lot, is being able to cook for myself more. And
you'll get sick of that real quick.
I mean, I'm sure I will eventually.
You'll be like, we're doing Uber Eats today.
Yeah.
But no, it is nice being able to cook. And I mean, I've seen you cook also a lot already. So you've got some skill already there, which is nice. You're not going in just completely rookie.
No, yeah, exactly. I have things kind of go-to dishes and stuff sometimes too.
Yeah. Well, cool, dude. Awesome. Me, I am on Christmas break because I'm a teacher, which means I'm better than everyone. No, definitely not. But no, things are good. Just honestly, break has been terrible. So I got on break last Friday. Last week of school was pretty good. Okay. I taught up until 2:45.
Okay.
At the end of the school day on Friday. Kind of. I mean, it's tough when you finish a lesson. We're like, okay, guys, we're going to talk about this new topic for 10 minutes, and then you're going to forget about it. And we're going to talk about it again 2 weeks later. But I took my job seriously. Now, Friday, school ends. Saturday, my son is in a co-op, homeschool co-op, and he had a showcase, and it went really well. It was awesome. People, everyone brought their own food, and I'm pretty sure I got food poisoning from the showcase somehow. Yeah, I'm actually not going to say what food possibly poisoned me in case anyone listens to this.
That's true. There could be people who listen from that group. So
no, it was cool. Like everyone brought really good food. It was tasty. It was delicious. But I ate something that once I took a bite of, I looked at it and said, that's a little sketch. Let's not take another bite. And then a day went by, and apparently food poisoning can delay like 24 hours. Like I remember waking up Sunday morning feeling a little off, but I was like, I'm tired. I have children. I probably just didn't sleep very well.
Yeah.
But then Sunday night, I was just also what I know really triggered it was when I didn't chug, but I downed like a full glass of eggnog. Like combined being a little food, like maybe because my son ate what I ate that we think poisoned me. Okay. And he had some stuff that was a little off, but nowhere near to the extent that I did. And I'm wondering if the eggnog is what just like did me in. Where like you threw the dairy, like the thick dairy and all the fat, and my body was like, hey, we were keeping it together and now we're just gonna give up and you're gonna suffer for the next 16 hours. And so I was up all night Sunday. Like I didn't even sleep in my bed because I told my wife, I'm like, honey, I'm feeling a little off. I might be okay, but just because I want you to sleep, I'm just gonna stay out in the living room. And I did not fall asleep till maybe 5 a.m.
Oh my gosh.
After a series of events. I lost at least 5 pounds. I could have lost very well up to 10 pounds easily.
Wow.
But that was miserable. So I was in bed all day Monday, which was awful because I'm on break.
Great way. That's what I was going to say. Great way to start break, right? Yeah.
And like I was so uncomfortable. Like my stomach was starting to digest food and it was keeping it together. And my wife was like walking in and checking on me, which is great. And you would think, oh, I've got all these kids. Being sick is an opportunity just to like relax and get away with relaxing. I was so uncomfortable. Like I couldn't even like enjoy whatever I was like distracting myself with. Like I tried watching the new Indiana Jones flick, Dial of Destiny. I can't even tell you what happens. I watched maybe like the first 30, 40 minutes of it. And then I like was in and out of sleep and woke up as the movie was ending.
Oh my gosh.
And I can't even tell you what I did that day. I would have to really think about it because I was just so out of it. But now I'm good. I had a lot of food last night. I made chicken rice with some spicy cucumber salad.
Ooh.
A little fancy schmancy.
That sounds good.
Yeah. So I'm good. I'm good now. We got one more week of break and I'm ready.
Wait, when do you guys start back up?
We start, I think, January 2nd.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah. Dude, oh my gosh. February is going to be nuts. I've got 3 retreats that I'm running. And, oh, dude, did I tell you? So I'm taking a group of kids to Steubenville.
Okay.
Did I tell you that?
No, I don't think so.
So
for like a Steubenville conference?
Yeah, for a Stubby conference.
Nice.
So I'm so pumped.
Rhys graduated from Steubenville.
I graduated from Franciscan. Yeah. In like 2017, I think. And I always forget. But this is my first year doing campus ministry. When I was studying at Franciscan, I explicitly stated I wanted to teach. You could do like a youth ministry concentration. I'm like, don't touch me with that. Okay. Yeah. I don't want to do 38 hours of paperwork and like actually do ministry 2 hours a week.
Yeah.
Because that's what youth ministry is.
Yeah.
God bless all the youth ministers out there. So I was like, I want to be a teacher. Yes, the kids in the Catholic schools are less inclined than the kids in youth groups to like want to hear what I have to say. But at least I'm spending more time like ministering, talking to them.
Yeah.
So this at the end of the school year last year, my boss said, hey, we want you to keep teaching, but we also think you would be really good as an associate campus minister. And I was like, I want to keep teaching as many classes as possible. And he's like, fine, you can teach. I had the option to teach as many classes as I taught last year, which would have.
Did you do that?
No, I removed one class.
That's wise if you're going to also add on. Yeah.
But I can add one on next year, which I probably do.
Nice.
But they're like, just take 1 year where you have one less class and then also tack on this campus ministry stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually really enjoyed it, believe it or not. I think because it's in tandem with teaching, that's great. But I brought up the idea to the head campus minister, Deacon Ken Gedeke, shout out to him. I was like, Deacon, I want to take a group of kids to Steubenville. And one of my coworkers, Katie, was like really supportive of that. She's awesome. Shout out to Katie. And we did that. And we said, like, how many kids do you think are going to come? Maybe 10. Maybe 10 are going to be open to it. So I had a meeting on Thursday, right before the Friday where break began.
Okay.
And I was sent out an email to like 30 kids who I thought of as like prospects who would like, these kids would be interested in going to Steubenville. And I sent out an email saying, here's the sign up. and I kind of gave my spiel. Like, this is an excellent retreat that without it, I would not be the man that I am today. I would never have met my wife. I would not be teaching you the way I am teaching you today. I probably would never have become a theology teacher.
Yeah.
And I also said I had free food.
That always helps.
Yeah, exactly. So Friday, I had like a lot of time off. I wasn't teaching a whole lot of classes on Friday. So I taught the first couple mods. And then I went and got food at the Safeway down the street. I bought like some croissants. I was like a little fancy. Croissants, soda, a bunch of like cheese balls, and got some plates. And throughout the whole day, I was like networking. I was like finding 10 kids who were on the fence who I knew were somewhat interested, but they needed a little bit of a push. So I would find like, okay, when does their class end? And I would run into them in the hallway. I'm like, yo, you want some free food? You should stop by my room, end of school. We're having a meeting about this awesome conference. You saw the email? Yeah. Okay. You want to hear more about it? Stop by my room. I have over 20 kids who are interested in this.
Wow.
And we don't have room for them. We have room for
Wait, how are you?
We have room for 12 kids.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And you know, like 22 kids show up, but not all of them are interested.
Sure, but I mean,
I've had already.
But it sounds like you can max out on the 12
for sure. Yeah. And I've already had 3 sign up.
Nice.
And I checked, that was like a week and a half ago. I have at least 2 other kids who are like, I am going on this. And I'm like, they just need to sign up, which is awesome. So
wow.
I was worried that we weren't going to bring any, honestly. I thought we were going to have to cancel because I'm working with St. Margaret's, actually.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
To take a group of kids with them, which is going to be cool. Because just like, it's nice to like combine groups when it's like your first year and you don't know exactly how the whole process
is that
runs.
why you only have room for 12? Like, is St. Margaret's bringing like their own crew, basically?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So it's also nice to have networking in the community.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling pretty hyped about that. I can't wait.
Sweet. That's awesome. Yeah.
So speaking of community.
Yeah. You did just say that.
That was not planned. It just happened. After 21 minutes and 47 seconds of riffing and introduction, if that's even a word, let's talk about the concept of community.
Yeah.
So, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to kind of define community like you proposed. But I guess it's a good question. So I'm more versed in friendship than Aristotle's concept of community. So I guess, do you want to start with Aristotle's concept of community and then I'll kind of jump in with the friendship side of that and how those two relate?
Well, I'm not so sure that we should separate the two.
No. I don't want to separate the two. I just mean, can you give like the general community thing?
I mean, I'm not really what I know about community from Aristotle is I've read Nicomachean Ethics once.
Okay.
And I took a class on it 3-4 years ago. And I remember like Nicomachean Ethics is a book all about virtue.
Mm-hmm.
And Aristotle describes virtue as a mean between 2 extremes. So to give an example with that definition is, let's take the virtue like courage. Okay. It is virtuous to be courageous. It is good to be courageous. Now, so imagine you're at war and you see someone just run blindly into battle where clearly bullets are being fired. Some people might call that courageous. Smart people would call that brash.
Yep.
Foolish. Okay. So that's one extreme version of what we would call courage that becomes not even virtuous anymore, but vicious.
Exactly.
Vicious. Okay, that's where the word vice comes from, is to be vicious.
Yep.
So that's an extreme. That's too much courage, is brashness. Now, if someone is in their bunker shaking, not doing their part while their friends around them are dying and giving up their lives, we call that cowardice.
Yep.
So we have cowardice on one end and brashness on the other. Now, between those two, we have the mean, the balance.
Yep. The virtue of courage.
The virtue of courage. So that's how Aristotle understands virtue.
Absolutely.
All virtues are like that, pretty much. Now, Aristotle eventually asks the question, what is the purpose of virtue? And virtue is ordered, it seems, to community, to friendship. Because if you think about it, a lot of virtues only find fulfillment in other people. Like, to be charitable. Okay, yes, I can love myself, but love also finds its fulfillment in me giving of myself. And who are you giving yourself to? Has to be, in most cases, another person. So virtue can't really exist without the community. Sure, in solidarity, like if you're in solitary like living space and you're alone, you can obviously offend the self via sin. That's what sin is in many cases.
But even I think to that's a great point. Now you're obviously jumping off Aristotle if you're talking about sin, but that is a great point that even quote unquote personal sins, that's something that I think is misunderstood a lot today. But a lot of people, but like theologians will tell you this, that even a personal sin, quote unquote, does impact the community because it impacts you as a person and how you perceive the world and how you perceive other people. And that therefore then impacts the community because it impacts your relationship to the community. Even if you committed that thing in private away from everyone else, whatever that sin is, it still impacts you. And then that affects how you interact with your friends and the people in your community.
That makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah. And you can think of an example in which you were hanging out with a friend group and one friend shows up and he's all kind of down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, he's like, I'm not like hurting anyone. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, but you're bringing everybody else down. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like whatever your stuff you're dealing with, like, and I'm not saying,
yeah, I was going to say, obviously you want to be
and
clear
just, like,
that
have
it's
fun,
not,
dude,
yeah, exactly.
okay?
Like it's okay to be down if you're
ignore your depression
down for whatever reason.
You're bringing the vibes down. No,
you meant more if you're down because of some personal sin you committed versus if you're down because of depression or something.
Right.
Yeah,
But the point I'm trying to say is like clearly things in our personal lives will go on to affect the community.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really the point you were making. But
yeah.
I'm just
Which
gonna give
okay,
an
so
example.
so using your point about Aristotle and virtue leading to community, I think a great way to so I think what you're getting at I think is a great thing of now I can jump in with the friendship piece of I don't know how much you've read of like Aristotle's 3 types of friendship.
I've heard of them before.
So the three like types of friendship that Aristotle talks about are, and there's different words that are used sometimes interchangeably, but basically like friendship of pleasure, friendship of utility, and then friendship of the good are the 3 ones. So like a friendship of pleasure is often like thought of as like someone who you are in relationship with because hanging out with that person brings pleasure to you in some way or another. So you think about, honestly, the example that I often use that I think is helpful to think about for many people is if you've gone to college at some point in your life, a lot of college friendships are often friendships of pleasure and or friendships of utility. But when you look back at it, when you've graduated from college and you go back and you look, or high school, let's say either one, high school or college, either of these can be true, that like some of those friendships last well past high school and college. And those are friendships of the good most of the time. Not always, but most of the time, those are probably friendships of the good. A lot of the friendships of where you had like a friendship with somebody in high school or college, and then after you leave and you're no longer in the same physical space anymore, and you kind of drift apart from that person, and like maybe you still, talk to him if you ever see him for whatever reason, but like, you're not really still close friends. Those are often friendships of pleasure or utility in the sense of like, when you're in college and you have, your buddy who you go to the bar with or whatever, and you're like, now, I'm not condoning getting drunk again, but let's say that you have that friend who like you didn't really have deep conversations with, you're not necessarily even on the same like moral perspective or whatever, but you could have a good time with that person. And you knew that you could always like, oh, hey man, let's go hang out and go, get drinks, or let's go, throw the football around or whatever, like some sort of pleasurable activity.
Yeah.
And then you have the friends where, maybe they're, I think a great example again with college or high school of like friendships of utility would be, let's say you have that friend that you're able to study with a lot, who's really helpful in like both of you can hold each other accountable to studying, and you're able to, you help each other, with tested questions and things like that. But then outside of those like study sessions, you don't really hang out with that person that much. Or maybe, maybe you do sometimes, but like it just never actually evolved into like a deeper friendship. You don't have like deeper conversations or deeper interactions.
I feel like a modern understanding of friendship of utility would be what we would call professional relationships.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it too. Exactly. Like coworkers. Like when you're working in the working world, oftentimes coworkers are friendships of utility because you want to, like, you need to have that relationship with them, and you should have a positive relationship with them. But like, there's nothing bringing you together outside of the utility of the working environment. Yeah, that makes sense.
Not to say if any of my coworkers are listening, I look at you as just something to be used.
Well, but so also that's an important point to make. So that's something I'm giving kind of the general definitions of each of the two, of pleasure and utility. But it's also important to recognize that those friendships are not inherently bad. It doesn't mean that, oh, you're using this person for pleasure or you're using them for utility. Aristotle would say that if you're merely using the person, that's not good. But it's more just that there's levels, is the way he thinks of it. And friendships of pleasure and friendships of utility can often lead to a deeper friendship of the good. And so like the third level, the highest level in Aristotle's mind, is friendship of the good. And I think we talked last time in our first episode about kind of what the good is on a certain level. We didn't get into a ton of detail about it, but the good to Aristotle is like virtue in one sense, like what you were talking about what a virtue is between the mean and the mean, between the deficit and the excess. And so Aristotle's concept of friendship of the good is that you're pursuing the good for the sake of the good. And so like you and I, let's say, in our friendship, are both oriented towards something that is outside of ourselves. So the friendship isn't merely about the pleasure that we get from spending time together or the utility of, us making a podcast together or having theological conversations or whatever, but it's about the good of something deeper. Now, I think it's important to me at least to clarify that like in a Catholic perspective, the good goes one step further. St. Thomas Aquinas takes the good one step further to be charity, to be the ultimate good of God, that we're both pursuing a relationship with God. And that's like what brings us together in a certain sense. But Aristotle, of course, doesn't talk about that on a specific level. He's just talking about the good in the sense of pursuing that eudaimonia is what he calls it, the Greek word. That means like
happiness.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
but not exactly.
It's like the existential form of happiness, like this like ecstasy almost of like the greatest happiness possible. And that's one of the things that's really fascinating about Aristotle, is that Aristotle had a concept of like happiness, of charity, of the good, of a God. He just didn't quite get to the Christian God. And part of that, some people would argue, is because Jesus hadn't become incarnate in the time period. Aristotle lives before the incarnation of Christ. And so that aspect of revelation wasn't present yet. But anyway, so those are kind of the three general forms of friendship, according to Aristotle, is friendship of pleasure, friendship of utility, and friendship of the good. And one thing that's important to note, which I was saying, is that friendship of pleasure and friendship of utility is often how friendships of the good start, according to Aristotle. That often you will, again, using those examples of the high school or college friends, most of your high school and college friends, and most friends in general, but that's a good example, you don't generally just like walk up to them and be like, are you pursuing a relationship? Like, are you pursuing the good? Like, you want to be like deep friends? Like, no, you find somebody who you have something in common with, and, you enjoy playing the same games or watching the same, shows or, whatever, listening to the same music. And then you like grow in relationship with that person through those activities of pleasure or utility. And then as that relationship forms, then you might start having some deeper conversations, and you might start doing some more meaningful things together where you're like, maybe we're actually pursuing the good at the same time, and we're pursuing this same thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm thinking about how I met my wife, how I needed help writing papers in college.
Exactly.
So, I mean, one might interpret that as beginning as a friendship of utility, but I clearly had no intention of it being a friendship of utility. Like, I'm like, I need help. Can you like work with me on this? But clearly I had other intentions.
Yeah.
But yeah, it makes sense. Like, you have to start at a certain level. And I wonder if you could make an argument that friendships of the good, which I think is something that you and I possess, it's also something that I think my wife and I possess, also requires elements of utility and pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Like, you and I sometimes need to just talk about ridiculous things.
Oh, yeah.
And just goof around. And like, this has nothing to do, well, in a sense, it has something to do with the good. It's bringing joy and happiness and fosters community.
And it builds, it builds relationship between us, because if all you ever did, and this is a thing that I've had to learn over the years, because I tend to be I don't know what the right word is.
You just want to get into the deep stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
I tend to dive deep very quickly. And it's something I've had to learn is that like that's actually not the best thing for community and for relationship with others. That like it's actually important to have those aspects of the pleasure and utility aspect of it. Again, that's what I'm saying is it's not meant in some like really utilitarian sense of like, oh, you're just using the person. It's meant in the sense that you just enjoy spending time with that person for the sake of the other. And then that can lead to something deeper in the friendship of the good. But it doesn't, and that's the important thing about the hierarchy too with Aristotle and these is that they're not meant to be like they're meant to be like building off of each other in a sense, like or like the friendship of the good entails aspects of the other two, basically. Like you're almost certainly going to have those other two aspects.
I know we're not talking about education right now, but since I'm a teacher, I'm always thinking about philosophies of education. And I was thinking yesterday of just if I were in charge of a school, what would be some things I would go on to implement? And one thing I think I would implement would be peer observations, in which I'm observing people in my department while they teach. And then like once a cycle or once a week, I have to observe someone in a different department teaching. Just because it's a good way to see how other people teach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hear what the kids are hearing from other teachers in the school on top of. It also makes the teacher a tad bit more accountable on top of that. But I was thinking like, what would someone think if they were to observe me? And I think that they would think I would waste a lot of time teaching. Because there are days where I'm teaching my students where like the first 5, in some cases, even up to 10 minutes are spent not goofing around with the kids, but just kind of getting the class going. And
building that relationship, right? That's what you're kind of getting at.
What, for example, one thing I do is at the beginning of every year, I have students answer a series of questions to describe themselves. And then throughout the semester, I got this from my professor, Dr. Bergsma, at Franciscan University. He was a biblical scholar.
Great man
and
writer.
He would have us do that. And it was just a way for us to get to know each other. I've taken a little twist in which I will pick one each day, like Dr. B would, read through it. And Dr. B would tell us who he's describing. But what I do is I make my kids guess who I'm talking about. So the kids already have a basic idea of who each person is. So they're typically able to guess. I've never had a class never guess who the kid is before.
Okay.
But sometimes it'll take like 5-7 minutes if you tack on prayer before class begins and attendance, and then you jump in and do that. Sometimes, like I said, it gets to 10 minutes because I like to make fun of some kids, because some kids will have like bad grammar in there. Like one kid said his favorite song was "Till I Claps" by Eminem. Have you ever heard the song "Till I"? It's called "Till I Collapse." Till I collapse and spit in these raps. Like, you ever hear that?
I mean, probably. I've heard most of Eminem, but I don't remember it.
But it's a song called "Till I Collapse." I remember like listening to it a lot in high school, like during like football workouts. But my student spelt it "Till I Claps," CLAPS, and I embarrassed him intentionally, like in good spirit, of course. You know what I mean? Like you got to be able to riff on each other, and I was like, "Till I claps? Are you kidding me?" Like, and everyone was just laughing, and he was laughing too. But like, so like I said, it can take a little bit of time for me to get my class going. And I always struggle, like, am I wasting too much time? Like, am I losing too much instruction time? But part of me like is like, no, I'm not wasting instruction time.
I agree.
Because almost every class I teach, we go on to have very intense discussions. I'm not a perfect teacher. I have a lot of work to do. I'm constantly rethinking my philosophy. But it's like, to your point, you can't get to the deep stuff unless you lay a foundation.
Yeah.
And so many people walk in, and teachers, thinking, no, this is professional, which it is, okay, but these kids just need to learn what I'm saying. And I get that to a certain extent, especially if you're an AP teacher and you are being told by someone else what to do. But it seems kind of like redundant. Not redundant. It just seems kind of foolish to think, how can you get to the deep stuff without building a foundation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
People?
And I think it's fascinating because it's something that I think our world talks about today at times, but just doesn't have it in these philosophical or these kind of more specific terms. But that whole concept of like, if you think about the questions of like moral things and stuff like that nowadays, without getting into a lot of details right now, but like those sort of things that people will talk about, there's this common thing that's always said of like, well, you can't, like you're not going to get anywhere if you just tell someone that something is good or bad or wrong or right or whatever without having a relationship with them first. Like,
It needs
And that's
God.
exactly. And that's the point that you're getting at, in a sense, is that relationship has to be there first. And I think that's true. I actually think that's really cool that you do that with your students, because I think that's true with teaching too. That I think that's one of the something that was done for many, many, many decades and even maybe centuries for a while in teaching, was kind of this concept of instruction, where somebody just gets up in front of a room and tells them all these things, and they're supposed to just kind of memorize the things, and that's it. But it's like there's no relationship there. And that was one of the things I think that, some of my professors in seminary, I think, did really well, actually, was kind of building either outside of class, because we were all in the seminary and so it was easier to do that, or in class, of kind of building those relationships a little bit more. They didn't do it quite the way you do, but I like the way you do it. But just kind of making sure that there's a dialogue there and there's a conversation. And I think that dialogue and that conversation partially builds that relationship too, which is better than simply, getting up in front of somebody. Well, all right, maybe I shouldn't say better, because that sounds like I'm criticizing other teachers who did different ways. But I think that's an effective way of doing it, is to have that dialogue.
You could make an argument too that, like, I've worked with teachers who probably could get up and just start teaching because they have such a powerful reputation already.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Where that pre-friendship or communal stage, or pre-deep talk about the good stage, is just like accelerated. Like, I mean, if you think of
like Scott Hahn,
yeah,
right?
I was literally thinking, if Dr.
Hahn,
Scott Hahn walked into the room and just started talking, I think you and I would stop this podcast and just listen.
Absolutely.
And not even question why he's here.
I'd just be really excited.
We'd be like, oh, let's just shut up and listen, you know? And I'm sure there's many people we can think of who are like that. And so some teachers, like especially some professors, can get to that point. But high school kids are different, and people are different. So yeah, I think that's a really good point that you made. That to get to that friendship of the good, they must first be friendships of pleasure or utility or both, and then lead to something deeper. Yeah. My wife teases me about that, where she's like, "Rhys, all you want to do is talk about deep stuff." Like there was this meme she found where it was a wife complaining. She's like, honey, yesterday you walked home and you just like walked to the door and was like, is free will even real? Like it's like, just, we got to talk about our day for a second, you know, we got to take it easy and then we can talk about these things.
I feel like my girlfriend probably gets annoyed with me about that sometimes too.
Peter, I just want to talk about I don't know, sports. I don't like sports, but just anything other than something deep.
I know. I have to actually, like, my spiritual director recently actually basically was like, Peter, I think you need to actually like intentionally like try to just talk about like casual things with people for a little while. And I was like, oh man.
Once you start having kids,
right.
Once you start having kids, you'll have plenty of time to have conversations that aren't deep, because you can't get super deep with kids.
Well, yeah, that's true. But
when they're at a certain age, but because I catch myself thriving for deep conversation, or like thirsting for deep conversations. But I also understand on your level, like that's all you do, and it's exhausting, and maybe you need a break.
Yeah.
So back to community.
Yeah, so community.
So virtue seems to be ordered towards community.
Mm-hmm.
Community begins with friendship. Friendship begins with, there's these three types of friendship, but we could also almost describe them as like stages. I'm not sure what would go first, utility or pleasure. Maybe they're the same thing.
Yeah, like I said, I think they're kind of
together.
two things that bridge into the one, but yeah.
But with hopeful goal of eventually friendship of the good,
yes,
to a certain extent. And that's what we want with the community, I think we could say, is a community that just isn't made up of people using each other. Because I think that's exactly the type of community that we live in the Western world.
Yeah.
Is just friendship of pleasure and utility, where we use one another to achieve something else, to only get something, and we think that's enough. We call it quits after that.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's I think that's one of the aspects of it too that is important, is this thing in the world today of like, it's okay to have friendships. Like, I guess that's the other thing though too, is it's okay to have some friendships that are just friendships of pleasure and just friendships of utility that may never lead to friendships of the good. But I think this is where, to the point you just made, I think it was great the way you phrased that, is community itself kind of needs to be primarily founded on friendships of the good. And that's, I think, the distinction that, because one of the things you think about the world today is so global, and we have so much social media and interactions through the internet and, you know, phones and all these different things, that I think people get overwhelmed, because I do think that there's a really interesting principle. Our friend Matthew was talking about this the other night at Bible study, but this principle of, like, there's a psychologist who has this principle that you can only have, like, deep communal relationships with, I think it's 150 people or something like that.
Yeah, I've read that before.
And I'm forgetting the guy's name right now. It starts with a D, I think, but Dobson or something like that, but or Dylan or whatever. But basically, like, I think that's very accurate, actually. That, like, one of the things that happens, I think, now is that people get overwhelmed because there's so many people that they're interacting with on a daily basis, both in their actual community, like around them physically, and then also through the internet and through, you know, all these different means of communication and everything, that people get overwhelmed, I think. And so then they just, like, almost like retreat to staying at that shallower level of, you know, friendship of utility and friendship of pleasure without ever going higher, because they're so inundated with so much interaction and so much things that they don't necessarily go further than that. Because I've noticed that about myself, that I tend to, I think, prefer the friendship of the good. Like, I tend to prefer going deeper in a sense, but that also means that I'm very limited in a certain sense. I have a lot of friends in one sense, but I also am very limited in my, like, other interactions. Like, I don't really spend a lot of time on the internet, and people who I am not physically around, it's hard for me to stay in communication with them. Because I dedicate my personal thing is that I end up spending a lot more time with people who I can be in person with than on my phone texting people, or, you know, social media or other things on the internet, you know, message boards or whatever. And I think that's something that, like, and I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing one way or the other. My point is just that I think that a lot of people I talk to, they do spend a lot of time on those more digital communications and on the more distant communications. Not that they don't spend time in their community too, they do. But I think the other aspect of that you can probably speak into too is that aspect of, like, even the people in our communities are so, they might be physically there, but, like, mentally, are we actually building relationships with them? Because you think about all the, like, you know, the grocery stores and the coffee shops and the whatever that we go to nowadays are most of the time people that we don't know at all. And so we're interacting with all these people on a regular basis that we have no knowledge of them. And so if you think about what we were just talking about how you have to build that relationship first to go deeper, well, how are you going to even build that relationship if you don't know the person at all?
It just seems like we almost have too many options as well.
Yeah.
Like, I think going back to the point of, like, a community beyond 150 becomes unstable. There's well more than 150 people in my neighborhood. There's well more than 150 people in this apartment complex.
Yep.
And you're just thinking, yeah, no, like, I'm not going to get to know them all.
Exactly.
And you just, like, you kind of give up. You might as well not. And so you're just kind of up to chance at that point when it comes to establishing friendships. And so, yeah, we're not really primed to have a successful community that eventually gets to the point where we arrive at a love for the good. And people could make the argument of, oh, well, your local community is your church. It is your religion, your synagogue, whatever. And that's where you find it. But doesn't it seem kind of ridiculous, to the point that you made earlier, that you have to travel quite a distance in most cases to get to that community?
Exactly.
When beforehand, people's community the community was right out the front door.
Yeah.
You didn't have to drive to it. It becomes more exhausting at that point.
Yeah.
So I think there's this geographical element to community that a lot of people aren't considering.
I agree for sure. I think there's both too. I think there's the geographical element and the numbers element, because also, even to the point you just made about, oh, your church is your community, or your synagogue, or your, you know, a lot of those places nowadays have way, way, way more than 150 people who are part of them too.
Yeah.
And again, like, now I'm not saying you necessarily have to have a deep relationship with every person in your community, but still, if you think about it, you know, like, we're both Catholic, probably both of the parishes that we tend to go to have
well over 1,000.
1,500 to 2,500 like quote unquote families registered at them.
Yeah.
And like that actually means more than that as number of people.
Yeah,
like
it's through 3 person.
that means it's
per
probably
family.
like, yeah, exactly. Like,
3 people
well,
per family.
yeah, I mean, maybe on average it's 2 or 3 because you might have some people who are single.
Well, no,
like
but
me
like
or
I'm saying,
whatever,
even
but
like multiply that by 3. That's insane.
yeah, exactly. So you think about, that's 4,500 to 6,000 people, let's say, at a lot of those parishes. Now, granted, these are fairly big suburban parishes, but still though, that's a lot of people. It's impossible to know. Like we're limited human beings. We're not God. We can't like perceive and conceive of everything. And so like, how would you know all of those people? You can't.
No.
It's just not realistic.
No.
And I think that's one of the things that happens too, is that to your point, there's both the physical aspect of like having to drive everywhere versus like walking out the door. And again, that physical aspect limits how many people you can have when you think about it, because
We have a lot working against us in today's world.
yeah.
Also with like social media being this lie of I want to connect everyone across the globe, into a community. And it's like, okay, but all we do is look at memes and crap on each other on social media. Rarely, other than our moms, are people on social media having genuine encounters with each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So I have this theory of why college is so awesome. I'm sure many people have opinions as to why college is so awesome. I loved college.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't love it because of partying, because I, first of all, wasn't really a partier. But what I loved about, and most people who do a lot of that in college eventually grow to like resent it, or it leads to other issues.
Yeah.
But I still think there's something inherently good about college, other than just the studying, but focusing on the community aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the fact that you're young, you're excited about life, you're typically a little bit more friendly,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone else around you is the same way.
Yeah.
So when you walk out that door in your dorm, you're surrounded by people who, for the most part, want to get to know you. And I know that's not the experience at every university, but I remember at Franciscan, okay? I love Franciscan.
Mm-hmm.
I love that place. I lived on wing, and yes, I lived on wing, like of a dorm, okay,
Mm-hmm.
with like 8 rooms. I lived on a wing with like my household brothers. But even freshman year, I lived on, I was in Disciples of the Word at Franciscan, but freshman year, I lived on Brothers of the Eternal Song, I think that's their name, their wing in Francis Hall. And I did not intend to that household, as I stated, but I still knew almost all the guys on that wing. I didn't spend a whole lot of time hanging out with them, but I could walk by their dorm and we would say hi to each other.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, because as a freshman, a couple of the older guys would walk into my room and just like say what's up and just see how I was doing, which was really cool. But when I lived on wing with my household brothers with a community, I mean, I had my dorm room, but my dorm room was almost sometimes just as much as the guy across the hall's dorm room.
Yeah.
People walking in and out, just talking with each other. And sometimes it gets a little carried away because someone's studying, and that's okay. But I think I loved it because I was really close to some people who I love to be around.
Yeah.
And that's friendship of pleasure, okay? But what was also so beautiful about that college experience was I was surrounded by people who all loved God. We all shared a common knowledge or a common
Mm-hmm.
appreciation of the good and a pursuit of the good, which brought us closer together. Now, not all universities are obviously doing that, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of people like college because they're close physically to a lot of people they like.
Yeah.
And that's not the same experience everyone else has, but I think that's one of the reasons I think that's one of the main reasons college is so awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think me, like I went to Towson here in Maryland, and it's a huge 22,000 students or whatever it was when I was there. So I think it was a little bit different than what you're describing, but I think one of the things, to your point, that is so uniting about college, and this is one of the aspects of community that's really interesting, is that there's that fundamental starting point in college that you're all there for the same like general purpose. Like even though everyone's studying different things and they're there for different reasons and they're in different places in life and they come from different backgrounds and whatever, you're all kind of there as part of that college experience.
So you're there
to
to
the
meet
point
people.
that you're getting at.
Yeah.
And like that whole experience of like studying, getting a degree, but then also like meeting people, like you're saying, and getting to know other people and, learning and growing and having fun, and like all those things kind of unite you.
That's why apartments don't work. Because by the time people move into apartments,
Yeah.
they're like, okay, like I'm just living here because it's close to what I'm really doing.
Yeah.
You know, I just need a space to live. But in college, you're right, people are disposed to create lasting memories and to live in community.
Exactly.
You have probably 20 people within 30 square feet. Not 30 square feet, like a
But
1600
you mean as
square
far as in this
1600
like,
square
this
feet
section of
you
the
know what I
building?
mean?
Yeah,
2,000
exactly.
square feet, we'll say. Yeah, that's the number, 2,000 square feet. Okay. But like you don't like you've only been here for a while, but I would bet that in 6 months you will.
I'm not going to know my
You're not going to know
probably.
that,
And it's
you know what
not,
I mean?
you know, yeah, exactly.
I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but it's just
no, I know
clearly
what you
people.
mean. I probably won't because the thing is, I've barely even seen any of them.
Yeah.
Like we all, you know, it's that classic thing where you come and go into your place and you don't interact with any. And like when I have, and it's so weird nowadays because when I have seen them, a couple of them, like they're not, you know, like I think that's and I don't say this to be critical of my neighbors. I just mean it in the sense that like I think everyone in our world today is very like suspicious of others in a certain sense, and so there's like this like hesitancy to even interact. It's like you might say hi to the person maybe, but that's about it. Like there's not even like a hi, how are you? It's just like a hi, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Like and I'm not saying that I fall into that too at times. So I'm not trying to be critical of my neighbors, but I have noticed that already that like there's just this very clear sense of like we're all in our little silos and we all stay separate and like, oh gosh, if I interact with that person, they might be different than me or they might, you know, I think that's one of the aspects too today is this like suspicion that is there of other people. Sadly, that's a big problem I think in our world today, that like if someone has a differing opinion or a differing thought about something or whatever, there's like this tension that's there.
Well, that's because I think this goes to the ultimate point that there are too many goods. There are too many ideas as to
You
what
mean,
is
yeah,
the
yeah,
ulti-
there's
well,
too many ideas
not too
of
many
what the
goods
good
because
is, yeah.
you can believe in an ultimate good, but there are a gradation of goods. But there's too many ideas of what the ultimate good is.
Yes,
which
that's
creates
fair.
an instability in these communities, which is dangerous. Like you said, it makes us untrust one another, or not trust one another. I will say, so we're on the East Coast, obviously. People have a stick up their butt.
I mean, I agree with
the-
you. I grew up in Kentucky
Yeah.
originally, and people were a lot more friendly in
Well, yeah,
general
yeah,
in the
that
South.
that little South area.
Yeah.
They're really sweet. And I'm from out west. I'm from Seattle. Out west definitely has its issues, but people are a little bit more open out there
Yeah.
too. But even when I lived in Denver for 3 years, I knew I would. I was pretty friendly with my neighbors in the apartment complexes I lived in, but I only ever got to know one family.
Mm.
You know, I only got, and that's after living in 3 apartment complexes in the city of Denver. So
Yep.
there seems to be a lot of problems. And I think the question now is, what do we do about it? So it's just to summarize the diagnosis.
Yeah.
Communities need to be about, they should be smaller. There are too many people in one location.
Yep.
I'm not pro. I'm not. This is the problem with environmentalism, where people become anti-human, and to a certain point, I want to make the point that that's not something we're trying to say here. We're trying to say that maybe we're too condensed. Maybe we
Oh,
need to
you're saying like we don't reduce by getting rid of people. You're saying we reduce by
spreading out.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
And
to
not-
be clear,
not
we're
spread
we're
out to
not
the point of-
suggesting that we should reduce the population or something.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think environmentalists don't openly say that, but I think deep down inside they're thinking that. Like, you know how many people at the beginning of the pandemic were like, "This is going to be so good for the environment."
Yeah,
I'm like,
I remember that.
What is wrong with you? Who can? That's just ridiculous. And I don't mean spread out in an antisocial sense. I just mean like clearly there's just it's more antisocial for us to be this close to each other.
Yeah.
So I think we're all too close to each other. What else? Not only are we too close to each other, we're too far away from people who think like us. Now, this is kind of a more dangerous point to make.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I think you obviously you saw my look. Probably you have to be careful, obviously, with the concept of think like us because
But I think that's what
it's
I want.
okay to think differently. In this, it's complicated because it's okay to think differently in a certain sense.
Yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more. But let's just summarize, and
Sure,
then
yeah.
because that's kind of where I wanted to take this discussion was
Okay.
to focus on that point. But there's too many people in one space. these people all think way too differently than one another. Not only do they think way too differently, but they all don't trust each other.
Yeah, that's an important point.
And on top of not trusting each other, we're not, like I think this kind of is lumped in with the fact that we don't trust each other, is we're just not disposed to get to know each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's the word I would use for that in this summary, is that there's a lack of intentionality today.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things I think that, especially with the world is right now, to that last point you just made of the three, would be that you need to be intentional to have good community.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think most people are not intentional about having good community necessarily.
Now, to focus this discussion on the idea of living around like-minded people, I've become a little bit more... I don't want to say the word radicals.
Yeah, don't use that
yeah.
I don't think that's how I would describe it.
I don't even want to use the word extreme, but I've become a little bit more intentional in the idea. Or I've become a little bit more intentional about who I surround myself with, because I've heard a lot of people talk about this in certain communities. Like, I've heard people in the conservative community say things like, when I was in college, I was a libertarian, where I was just like, you do you, you know? And as long as you don't tell me what to do, I won't tell you what to do, and we're fine, and we can live in the same community.
Yeah.
But then you have kids, then you have a family, and you begin to see how, as we were talking about earlier with sin, the impacts that individual sins has on the community.
Yeah.
And how that the impression that leaves on your children. And so the more and more I've thought about that, the more communities I've been a part of, and I see who my kids are, if I were to stay in that community, go on to be looking up to, I think, I'm not sure this is where I want to stay. I'm not saying that's how I feel about where I currently live. Maybe I do. But the point I'm just trying to make is, once you have a family, you begin to think deeply about this matter, about the community you live in, and how much of an impact living around different minded individuals, like the impact that living around people like that has on your small community, your family. So what do you think about living around people who think differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have very similar, I think this is part of where this whole thing came from, in a sense, is that we have very similar thoughts about this. I think I tend to be kind of similar. I've actually noticed that it's really funny, because people have commented on this, I think, in a sense, to me, but over the last several years of my life, I've kind of what's the right word? Maybe not unintentionally, but like inadvertently, like done that already in who I like build relationships with.
I think a lot of people are doing that.
Because what I've seen is like it's very difficult to have. Well, so that's I think it gets down a little bit to the point that we were talking about with Aristotle and the different types of friendship and all that you can't have a friendship of the good if there's no agreement on what the good is.
Which I think is a very powerful thing to say, with a lot of consequences.
Well, exactly. And that's where I tend to come with my concept of like deeper friendships. I think that's the thing, is that I tend to surround, as far as the community aspect goes, I'm often surrounding myself with people who have the same or a similar definition, in a certain sense, of what the good is. And I think that's the thing. And I think the distinction I would make as far as that goes, to be clear that it's not like I'm just like trying to, like that whole thing about like-minded. Like, it's not like, oh, you just want everyone who thinks exactly the same as you. That's not healthy either, I don't think. But I think the thing is that within the realm of that concept, like, you can have tons of different ways of getting to the same good within a community, as long as you agree on that first principle of what the good is.
Are you talking? So if anyone's a non-Catholic and they're listening, I'm sorry if this analogy will fall flat, but are you saying, so for example, in the Catholic community, there are people who like to go to a Latin Mass, which is very reverent, and
people like me,
people like Cephas over here, Peter, which I have attraction. I've been to one Latin Mass. I've wanted to go to more, but it's just downtown.
It's very beautiful.
It's downtown, and I've got a lot of children, and just dragging them downtown Sunday morning is just a lot. And also the parish that we're attending, the priest is really good with my kids. So we go to what we call a Novus Ordo Mass, which if anyone's ever been to Mass or seen a Mass on TV, it's probably been Novus Ordo, where it's all in English, and it's fairly simple. But with the Latin Mass, it's typically what we would call ad orientem, in which the priest is facing away from the community. It doesn't always have to be ad orientem, but almost everything is in Latin, thus the title Latin Mass. And there's a lot more incense and a lot more bells and whistles, basically. They pull out everything. I know that's a very
I mean, I was going
crude
to say, I would
description
be
of the
careful.
Latin
We'll
Mass.
probably have a podcast at some point about liturgy. I would be careful about drawing too many distinctions there, because the way that the Novus Ordo is celebrated in most places right now is not actually what the rubrics say that how it should be. But anyway.
Right, yeah. Novus Ordo is basically just in the vernacular, in the language of the people. Latin Mass is in Latin.
Yeah, so there's supposed to be a lot more Latin in the Novus Ordo, but yeah.
Yeah, true. So there are people in the Catholic community who are divided as to like which Mass. Like there are some people who will not receive at a non-Latin.
Yeah,
Mass.
That's unfortunate. But
That is unfortunate. See,
like
so what you would say, forgive me if I'm speaking on your behalf improperly, where there are people who can find a good Novus Ordo community, and then there are people who can find a good Latin community. And those people can also, in a sense, be in community with one another. They all believe in the ultimate good, God, Jesus Christ, the Blessed Trinity. But there are different ways in which to achieve it that aren't too different, but different.
Yeah, I mean, I would steer a little bit clear of the Mass in that conversation, because there's a lot more to say about that and a lot of depth there. But I get the concept.
You get the analogy.
I overall agree. The analogy I would use within the Catholic sphere, and I think this could be true of like many Christians too, actually, is simply that you can believe in God, and as a Catholic, let's say, as long as you're following the 5 precepts of the Church, like let's just assume that one is following the 5 precepts of the Church, which again we can explain those in a future episode or whatever. But there's many different devotions, for example, in the Catholic Church that are like particular devotions that are not required to participate in at all as a Catholic, like the Rosary, Divine Mercy Chaplet, the
These are all
Angelus,
different types
like
of prayers.
all these different prayers. These are like devotional ways that Catholics pray and whatever. You can all be part of the same like Catholic community, even all part of the same, parish that go to the same Mass and everything. And you could have a wide range of people who one really likes this devotion and one really likes this devotion and one really like. That's part of my point, is that like they don't. It's like that fundamental thing that like, okay, you all believe in God and you all have a concept of what that means to pursue the good. Which
you believe
is
in
God.
the creed too.
Yeah, exactly, the creed of the Church. But then aside from that, you can have many different views and even many different ways of approaching non-religious things in a certain sense. Like, again, as long as you're following a particular framework, there's many different ways to approach, what job you have and how you approach, where you, like work and like things like that are, again, like, so I guess that's my point about, being able to have differing opinions and different worldviews and perspectives and all that. But that fundamental one, I think, is the one that is so difficult nowadays.
Yeah, an overall appreciation for the good, as well as an agreement as to what the good is.
Yeah.
So,
because I think it's important to just like say this really, that like my perception would be that I would say that many people in the world today would probably describe the good as something along the lines of the ability to pursue whatever you think is best, or something like that. Something that like kind of like we talked about last time, that's a little bit like relativism almost, in a sense, that like because a lot of people that I've encountered, at least today, don't necessarily believe in an objective good. And Aristotle, even though he didn't have a concept of God in the way that we do now, Aristotle believed that there was an objective good that people should be pursuing.
Yeah, this does bring back what we talked about in our first episode, where we talked about existentialism, in which people create their own good or create their own meaning. And my number one critique, and I think we talked about it in the first episode of that philosophy, is the natural division it will cause, and on a massive scale. If everybody's pursuing their own good, there was no unity in the community. And without
Exactly.
without unity in the community, there's no community.
Correct.
It's impossible. You can't just continuously tolerate one another. We like to act like we can tolerate one another, but that experiment is obviously not working very well.
Yeah,
We're more divided than ever, if anything.
I agree.
So I think back to the olden times. I'm not just talking about like in Christendom or in Christian communities, where in Europe, after a certain time period, if you lived in a town, that entire town went to mass.
Yeah.
This is also the same deal in the Middle East after a couple hundred years after Muhammad, where everyone in that town was Muslim and got on their knees 5 times a day and prayed facing Mecca.
Yep.
Everyone did it. Everyone was in agreement. And I think because of that, the communities were happier with one another. You see it in Mexico a little bit too. When I was in Tijuana in high school a couple times, everyone seemed happier there, despite the cartels running a lot of things and people living in extremely small houses, and everyone was wearing broken down, worn out clothes and torn up shoes. But there's a lot of Catholics in Mexico, and I know it's not perfect, obviously.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be rude to assume that everyone went to mass, or almost everybody went to mass in a certain community in Mexico.
Yeah.
In the U.S., that's completely different. In this very apartment complex right now, if we took a census, a small little census, I'm sure we'd get a diverse result. And I'm not saying we're anti-diversity by any means, but we do need to consider, are we lying to ourselves by thinking we can foster community by forcing ourselves to say toleration is what will bring us together? Because toleration is important to an extent, you know?
Yeah, but I think that's where, to your point, I think toleration has to be within the right context, though.
Of course. Yeah.
Like,
I mean, anything.
toleration can't just be. I think that's one of the problems today, is that there's this idea of like toleration as in just tolerate anything, and that's not good toleration.
Well, also, toleration isn't meant to be like forever. Like when you think of the word tolerate, you're like, okay, I'll tolerate this, but that's like a for now statement. It's
sure,
like,
I mean, that's true, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's just to add on to what you're saying, because what
Yeah.
you're saying makes sense. But also, I think even in like a worst case scenario, I'll tolerate this for a little. Like, let's say, I don't know why I'm thinking of this example. Let's say one of my kids becomes like a drug addict, you know, and they need to come home because they relapsed or whatever during recovery. I'll let them stay with me for a little bit. But if they begin using again, you know,
That toleration wanes.
that
is what you're
toleration
saying, right?
wanes.
Okay.
Yeah. And someone's
sure.
like, oh, you stopped tolerating and loving your kids. It's like, no, sometimes like the loving thing to do is to show tough love, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I get scared when I have these thoughts about community, honestly, because they seem to just ask us to divide people up and put each other into different camps.
Well, but I think here's my thing that I'm thinking about in this conversation we're having right now is the recognition, and again related to what we talked about last time, is I am of the belief at this point that you really just fundamentally cannot have true community with those who don't even believe in God, or those who don't believe in like the concept of like the Abrahamic God or whatever, like the God of Abraham, in the sense of like what we were talking about last time when we talked about how do we describe it, like the theism people that believe in God, that even if you're talking about the difference between Christians, Jewish people, Muslims, like those three, at least we may not agree on all the details about God, but I would personally still argue that we believe enough in the fundamental concept of God as the good that you're pursuing that I think you could theoretically have. Now, it's like gradations, like you were talking about. I think you could have a community with all of those people. But I think the place where it becomes a problem to me is when you're trying to build community with people who believe in a good, like a Christian or a Jewish person or a Muslim who are practicing their faith, who believe in like God as the good, let's say, or they believe in a good, versus many people in the world today who just say there is no one good. There is no good that we're trying to pursue, because then you're talking about Alasdair MacIntyre, who's a great philosopher of recent times, talked about this concept that like if you're having a discussion with someone and you discover that you two are approaching something with completely different premises, like the premise of your argument, the whole thing that it's founded on, are completely different, you won't be able to actually have a real, true discussion because you're never going to be able to meet in the middle if you're starting from completely different foundations.
Well, you and I would never be able to get to this point in the conversation about community if you and I didn't agree with a foundational understanding of community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's founded on the good and that there is a good that
Yeah.
we believe in.
Yeah, and friendship, it's founded upon friendship. Yeah.
And
yeah,
true friendship is founded on the good. Though.
Yeah,
That's the
exactly.
thing.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. No, I don't. Because I think to myself, okay, so now what? What do we do? Because I have more to say about like the Judeo-Christian Islamic idea of community. Like maybe we could live together. I like to think that we could. And to your point, is perfect community possible? No, it's not. And and that, especially from a Catholic perspective, and from a Christian perspective, and a Jewish or Islamic perspective, the perfect community is heaven.
yes, correct.
And
And that is the only place where there is perfect
that's
community.
the only place where there's perfect community. You don't even really need to believe in heaven to accept the idea that there's no such thing as a perfect community in this life.
But that's where I was saying the thing about gradations, that I think my point about the Judeo-Christian Muslim aspect was that that you can live in community with those people, with any of those people, whether it be Christians, Muslims, Jewish people, all of them together, that they can live in community together. But
I'd have to think a little bit more about that because there are some differences that make it almost.
well, but that's what I'm trying to get at with the gradation thing. Is
Right,
that
right.
I'm not wanting to explicitly say this, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think it's easier and would probably make for more perfect communities in a sense, like closer to perfect, if you're primarily living among your main community, let's say, is of the same belief system as you, in the sense of, if you have Jewish people living together, if you have Muslims living together, if you have Christians living together. But I don't want to say that in a way that sounds like I'm trying to be overly divisive.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why I'm like hesitating on that. Is I'm not trying to say like we should all just go live in our little pockets and never interact with each other. That's not what
that's a
to
very
be very
anti-Christian
clear, that's not
thing.
what I'm trying to say at all.
Yeah, see, yeah, that's why this conversation is so scary, and we have to be careful with what we say.
Yeah.
And maybe I haven't, but clearly the gospel calls us to go out to all nations and be a light to the world. And St. Paul clearly says there's no Jew, no Greek, no male, nor female. Like, obviously, there's Jewish people and Greek people, male and females, but he's saying that we're all one in Christ, whether or not we acknowledge it. So each and every individual is worthy of respect and has rights associated with them and is made in the image and likeness of God. But I'm thinking about for ourselves decisions that we want to make.
Correct. Yeah.
How do we, because we're not going to achieve perfect community, but clearly we're so, this is the problem that I have, is I was discussing the concept of memorization with a friend recently, and I've been assigning memorization quizzes, and there's a big anti-memorization movement in education right now, which I understand, but human history is characterized by overreactions. That is not, I came up with that quote, but it is not my idea. It's basically Hegel's dialectic, where we have a movement, we call it a thesis, an argument, and historically there's always an antithesis to that movement. There's always a response. And then Hegel goes on to say that there's after the thesis, the antithesis, there's a synthesis, there's a harmony between the two, or a combining of both. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with him. I just think it's overreaction after overreaction after overreaction.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, for example, with memorization, like all we do is force the kids to memorize. Now there's like this anti-memorization movement, and it's like, whoa, just hold your horses there.
Yeah, we need both.
Memorization is very important. Okay, so when it comes to the concept of community, yes, perfect community is not attainable, but what we have right now is a joke.
Yes, exactly.
I think the fact that we've lived in close communities before in our apartment complexes, and we're not at least talking to each other is a disaster.
Well, and I think, okay, so I think this is where maybe the way to do this, I think, would be to take it to take what we've just talked about. This first section has been primarily like definitional, broad concepts of community. And now this next section is more, how do you and I want to live out community in our particular lives, which I think could be beneficial for other people listening. And so that's, I guess my point in that is to make it clear that like what we're going to say here, at least what I would say here, is not necessarily intended to be definitional, this is how community should be per se, but more this is how we feel right now that we think it would be most beneficial for us and for our children, in your case, your actual children, in my case, my future children.
Right.
In our particular lives and circumstances.
Yeah, and it's not to say, and when I would discuss or think of the community I would want to live in, that wouldn't mean me cutting myself off entirely from the world either.
No, yeah, well, let's talk about that, because
yeah.
that's what I'm saying, is that like I think this section would be more like we can now talk about like what we view, because we've had a conversation with some of our friends about an idea of almost like starting our own kind of intentional community, and we've made that very clear in those conversations of like we're not talking about living in the middle of nowhere and not interacting with the outside world. We're talking about one of the ideas that we've had is in a certain sense like buying some big like each of us, like one person might have to buy it initially, but then everybody owns their own separate piece of land, but like you're all in the same area with your own houses and everything, but you still go work, like you would still be a teacher at a high school somewhere. Like you're still teaching in the world. I'm still working as an accountant in the world. Like our other friends are still doing their jobs in the world. You still go to the grocery store. You still interact with the world. But the idea is that you have a local community that you can come back to, and that your kids can grow up around other kids who have parents who have similar views on God and the world and things like that. And I think for me, that's something that I've had conversations with actually a lot of different people now who all desire this same thing.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
You win $1 million in the lottery somehow, and you have the opportunity, no financial restraints, to create a community, move to a community. What does that community look like, and how do you live in it?
Yeah, I mean, that's my thing would be, like I said, would be to buy a big plot of land somewhere, probably like, well, I don't want to be too specific right now, but because I don't want people to steal the land that I want to get. But but let's just say like somewhere out in like the western part of Maryland, for example, not super far out west though, mind you, because again, I'm saying I want to still be able to interact with the broader like community. So like a little bit west of Baltimore, let's say, in a certain sense. You find a big plot of land somewhere.
Oh wait, you don't want to.
Maybe in that area, who knows?
Who knows?
But let's say you get like a big plot of land somewhere, and you then divide it. I mean, obviously I know there's like practical elements of governmental restrictions and licensing and all that crap, but like we can figure that out. But basically, like you then sell the different pieces. Like you'd buy that land and then you sell the different pieces to different people, so they all own their own separate thing. Again, not a cult. Like we're not trying to have like one person own the whole compound or some weird thing like that. Just like everyone.
Peter
owns
is
their
the leader of the compound.
Oh, gosh, yeah, no, exactly, not that. So everyone owns their own like little plot of land, like an acre or 2 or 3 or whatever. We're all in the same kind of general. We all have houses in that land. We're all in the same general thing, and then each of us who works still works a job in the world where, if I'm an accountant, I work from home sometimes anyway, but I also go into the office, and like I would go into the office still. And I'd still go to the grocery store and still go to the gym and still go to the, whatever, like all the normal things that people do now. But what that means is that then when we want to, let's say that we all live in this general area, then on a random Tuesday night, if we want to have a get together, like a dinner or whatever, there's not a ton of travel that has to happen. It's not difficult at all. It's just, all right, everybody come over to this person's house, or on the weekend or whatever, we could all have a cookout or whatever. And I'm not saying that happens every weekend either. That's just like a reality that makes it a lot easier, and
it's
especially
just easy to be in community.
Exactly, and especially the kid thing, because this is something that I've heard other people like Matt Fradd and some other Catholics talk about when they do live in these kind of similar communities. That you think about, we have several friends who have kids just like you in the same general age range. So as their kids start to grow, they can easily go over to each other's houses because they literally live right next door. Like, even if it's an acre, a couple acres or whatever, that's easily walkable. Those kids can go over to each other's houses on a regular daily basis and go hang out with each other without any sort of unnecessary, like, oh, we got to, because that's something I've seen too that just saddens me so much now. Is like kids don't interact as much because they don't have like that's another weird thing about the subdivision thing too, is that how often do you see these places where there's like maybe 2 families in a whole division area? Like, and so the only kid you have who's anywhere nearby is this one family, versus like having multiple families in an area where you can all go there without having to have your parents drive you. Because that's, again, that driving thing. Like, that makes life a lot tougher on everyone, because what if the parents are working? What if they don't have time to drive the kid over there?
Right.
Well, then the kid's stuck at home and their only means of hanging out is through, social media or some internet interaction or whatever. And that's not like
ideal.
fake, basically, in a sense. And so like, that's not helpful for kids growing up. So that's part of my point too, would be that in this community, these kids could easily just go hang out with each other and play outside too. Cause that's another thing that I think is so lacking nowadays, is kids playing outside a lot.
I'm very fortunate in my neighborhood to live in a cul-de-sac where there's a lot of people with kids, and they're like always outside. My kids are playing with them.
Wow, that's cool. Actually pretty surprising to me, because a lot of places I've seen don't have that. So
in the rest of my neighborhood, like I'll leave a little early to go to work, and I'll see kids at the bus stop. And when the high school bus is picking them up, I'm like, I've never seen this kid in the neighborhood. Like, I live in a big neighborhood, but I run in my neighborhood. I'm driving through my neighborhood a lot. And I like to think like, oh, I have a good understanding of like who lives here. But when that high school bus comes out, there are so many more kids in my neighborhood than I realize. And I'm like, where are you guys all the time? And these aren't like kids who are 17 driving around. These are like 14, 15 years old, kids without licenses. And I'm like, you are never outside, dude. It happens a lot. So yeah, to your point.
Well, and there's also, I think this is another aspect of this is related, slightly different, but I think it's very, very important of the whole conversation about community. Is another aspect for us to think about as like, well, not future parents. I meant future parents of older kids.
Right.
Because you are a parent currently, but like parents of older kids in the future, is like this thing that happens so much today that to me is really dangerous, and actually we need to be very careful about, is the thing of like the kids have all these different activities that they're doing, which then ends up literally taking the family so far away from the community and from the family all the time, that there's never, like, they're just always on the go. Because to your point, I bet part of it with those high school students is, some of it is that they probably hang out inside a lot on computers and stuff. The other aspect is probably that many of them probably have sports and other things that they're doing on a very constant basis, where their parents are like driving them, every day. It's like I literally have friends who will comment on like, I'm gonna rephrase this, but the point is that like there are friends who go through this constant thing of like having to try to like get one kid to this place and another kid to this place and another kid to this place, and there's only 2 parents, and the kids can't drive because they're all under the age of 10, let's say, and like it's like, all right, at some point, let's just like slow this down a little bit and recognize that like if you have more in your local community, you don't need to necessarily, again, not saying don't interact with the world, not saying that the kids can't do sports sometimes, but like, let's scale it down a little bit. Like the extremes thing. I think our world has gone to an extreme with that, where kids are just always doing all these things. And like that takes away from the family unit on some level, I think.
And to give those parents who are constantly traveling around, moving nonstop, they're being told that that's what a good parent does.
Yes. To be clear, I'm not trying to like crap on those
right.
parents.
I didn't think you were,
right,
but
you're
just
right.
to
No,
listeners,
that's a good
like
clarification.
Clearly, these parents are being told. So as a teacher, so remember how I was talking about how I have a lot of kids who are interested in Steubenville? Mm-hmm. I have had a handful of kids. I would have close to 30 kids who are interested if it weren't for sports.
Of course. Yep.
I've had kids I presented the idea to, who were genuinely interested, and they're like, what is the date for that? And they're like, oh, I have a baseball tournament that weekend. I'm like, how do you know you have a baseball tournament that, like, we're 6 months away, 7 months away.
When is this? Is it over the summer?
Yeah, it's in the summer. Yeah.
For one
weekend, for one small weekend.
When their sports weekends are? That's insane.
When I was a kid, you got your kids involved in sports, whether or not they were athletic, just because it was good for them. It sounds weird, but I don't want my kids doing sports.
I agree.
I want them
I'm very
playing
much like
with
that.
kids.
Yes,
maybe
absolutely.
playing sports with them, but I don't want them on like legit teams because those teams are asking a whole lot out of them.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
disgusting.
Well, especially like,
I
I
could
mean,
say how-
you know what? I'm just gonna say it anyway because people can be upset with me if they want. But like, especially
Make my
like
day.
travel leagues,
Oh
to
my
me,
gosh.
just drive me insane because those things are literally like people will spend basically entire weekends on these like travel league trips for sports, and it's like, that's not like no, like these kids aren't like professional athletes. Like that's not the no. It's just no.
Well, so the parents are being told you want, and I know you know this, but I'm just saying
No,
it
I
for
know
the
you're
sake of the
saying it for the- yeah.
conversation. Parents are being told you want your kid to be good at this sport. They need to do more than the person next to them. And the way that they can do more than the person next to them is not only to play in one league, but to play in 2 leagues, to have a rec league or whatever, or a school team, but also a travel team on top of that.
Yeah.
And for them to have a trainer who works with them
Yep.
on a specific skill. That's wild for kids.
Well, and I think
who have school and some have jobs on top of that.
And I think that's another great point though, that I think one of the things that bothers me about that personally is this concept today that's pushed a lot with a lot of the sports stuff of being better than the next person. And I think personally I find that dangerous because of the comparison game that happens of like and I know I have people who've pushed back on this because they say, well, it's really good for building virtue and it's good for building discipline and all that. And fine, that's true. And I think that's a good aspect of sports.
Yeah, but there's a thing called obsession.
Exactly. That's my point, is that I think you can do that, again, to the point of like virtue being the mean between the excess and the deficit, that like I think there's an extent to which you can encourage a kid to do well in a sport and try to excel and try to do really well. But if you're constantly saying, oh, well, you're only the 3rd best at this sport, you should be the 2nd best, or you should be the best. Well, that's never achievable. Like, again, it's that thing of like, it's the thing of like, we're never going to get to perfection in this life. And I think that's a game to me that is dangerous, that leads to this like perfectionism that so many people in our world today struggle with. And I've struggled with it at times in my life. And I think that's where like it's important to teach kids discipline and virtue and to train well and all that. So like, again, that's where I think, to your point, like I think playing sports can be good, but I'm very, very, very hesitant personally to allow, my future kids, hopefully, God willing that I have kids, but to allow them to be on a lot of these teams, because I think that's one of the things that is just pushed so hard, is this obsession with being the best.
Yeah. Well, I could rant about sports with kids. I think we could chalk it up to almost slavery, actually. Because people are making a lot of money off of kids nowadays. And we're being told that it's for the good of the kids, but we'll see. I have so many students who are tearing their ACLs.
Oh my gosh!
Kids did not tear their ACL. I mean, yeah, it happened occasionally.
Yeah, but that was very rare
I cannot
back in our time.
I can name maybe one kid who tore his ACL when I was in high school.
Yeah, that was
I could
way
name
more rare.
6 kids, and there's about 10 probably at the high school that I'm working at right now over the past 2 years.
Well, I mean, another example of that, I mean, you see it manifesting itself in the major leagues, but it's a result of how they're trained in the minors and in high school and stuff, is like baseball pitchers. Like 95% of pitchers now are having Tommy John surgery.
That's why of course, when
and
you
like,
have a 10-year-old
it's
throwing a
because
curveball.
exactly,
like,
that's the thing. You have all these kids who are, young kids throwing as hard as they can and throwing all these special pitches and everything at age, like you're saying, 10, 11, 12, and they do it for years, and then
body
guess what?
Out.
Their arm gets thrown out. I wonder why that happened. But anyway, to the point. Let's rein it back
community.
in. But my point about that was that I do think that's a thing that also can impact the community aspect, because it pulls us a lot of it. Because even the travel league thing, when you think about it, if you're constantly on the weekend traveling away from your main community, physically, you're not around your community.
Yeah.
How are you going to build community if you're like every weekend, oh, we go away for the weekend to do this or do that? Like, there's no sense of community there.
Yeah. Sports is being corrupted 100%. And that's one of the main reasons kids do not attend youth groups or their local religious communities, is because of sports. So your perfect community, Peter,
Yes.
looks like you buying some land and then selling pieces of that land to friends and family and you guys are, and it's not like a compound, but
No,
like
God,
you
no.
guys are within, you guys are within like a certain square mileage, or maybe even a few thousand feet, where like some people can just walk to each other, and you have more opportunity for community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So okay, so my vision of community.
Mm-hmm.
There are things I want to say, but there are also things that I should say. Okay, let's say I was given $1 million, and I could move or do whatever I wanted. I think I would move to the same area you're talking. Maybe not exact. I would have to pray about it, but an area like that,
Sure.
outside, far away from the city. And when I say far away from the city, I mean at least like an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of the city.
Okay.
Because you don't want to be. I think cities are disgusting. I think you would agree with me. I don't want to be completely in hillbilly nowhere, but I think we need to be connected to the world to a certain extent.
Sure.
But maybe 2 hours outside of the city, in a place where life is a little bit slower, and I honestly wouldn't mind living in the suburbs as long as they were surrounded by people who were like-minded enough. And not everybody in the suburbs are like-minded. I mean, because like what you are creating is basically a suburb.
I mean, yeah, sure. Although I still think there's more land in my
yeah.
picture of it.
True.
People would have more land. They'd be able to grow their, like, part of my community, to be clear too, would be like people would be able to grow some of their own like
Food.
vegetables and food, and maybe have a little bit, like a few animals and stuff. Not huge farms, but like enough land that you can do those kind of basic things. Again, you still go to the grocery store and stuff, but like you can supplement that with some of your own stuff.
Yeah.
So it would be similar.
I wouldn't be opposed to like living in the suburbs, honestly, as long as it's not insanely dense. But some suburban like area, I honestly I used to think that I would like living on a farm away from everybody with my family, but that's just too far.
Mhm.
That kind of goes against the idea of community, I believe. So I would like to live in a somewhat populated suburban area, not super dense, spread out enough, but close enough where we could kind of have the same experiences that you were describing, with lots of kids, where my kids could go out and play, where we could at least once a week have like a community dinner together, or at least
Yeah.
dinner with a certain number of families,
Yeah.
and just not have to worry about what my kids are being like exposed to.
Yep.
Now, I think a perfect neighborhood would be, in my world, mostly Catholic. But
I agree.
But I also would totally be fine with a few people who think differently, but at least care about the good. Like I have a buddy who's a Buddhist, agnostic atheist. I haven't dug that deep into his worldview, but from what I can discern, he's definitely Buddhist, and he cares about the world. He actually shares a lot of the complaints that you and I share, and I wouldn't mind having a community with that person to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Because I want to commune. I do want to spend time with people who think differently than me.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want them necessarily determining the vibe of the community, if you know what I mean. I want to live in a Catholic community with my kids, just like I would respect a Jewish person wanting to live in a Jewish community with their kids.
Absolutely.
But I also would love for that Jewish person to want to speak with me, and I would love to speak with them. Same with a Muslim person or whatever. So I would like to live in a community that's very Catholic. We're all tight with one another. We're friends. We get along. We have good conversations. We have silly conversations. But also it's complicated enough where we're going out to the world. You know, we're having other ideas. We're talking. Like you and I are not opposed to having someone who's an atheist on this podcast.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like that would be a great conversation. I would love to pick their brain. I would love it if they picked our brains. But yeah, I think that's what a realistic ideal community looks like in today's world. Living together with people who are mostly like-minded, at least a bunch of people or some other people who care enough about these deep questions in life and think deeply about matters and are willing to discuss them. But
yeah, exactly. And I think this is a conversation that we've had with other people, and it's something that I've had now enough with enough people that I think it's actually, for me in my situation at least, I think it's actually potentially achievable in the future. Not necessarily the, I obviously there's kind of the joke about like the buying all the land and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's not going to happen.
But more the actual practical aspect of living in the same general area. We might not be able to live as close as I would like to.
Yeah.
But even like all of us living, a group of us living in the same. I'm not sure what the right word would be. I don't want to call it a city exactly because it wouldn't be like Baltimore or whatever. But like one of the like surrounding areas of Baltimore, like Frederick, for example. Like to the point you mentioned of Frederick earlier, like somewhere in that general vicinity, let's say, where if everyone in our community group moves out to that general area, then it would be a lot easier for all of us. We're all within, let's say, 20 minutes of each other or something. It's not as ideal or as ethereal as my thing of like everyone living in the same general property area, but like if you're all in that same general area, then you can still do a lot more of like versus like right now, a lot of the people who I know and I'm good friends with and who I would want to be as part of that community sort of live anywhere from like 20 to 30 minutes to like an hour and a half to 2 hours from each other. And so like they're spread out a lot more versus. That's what I'm saying is if there was a way to kind of condense that into a smaller, and I think that's a little bit more like the Steubenville example, from what I understand of Matt Fradd and some of those Catholics who live in Steubenville, that some of them live in the same like neighborhood, but then also some of them don't live in the same neighborhood, but they live in the same general area.
And
like,
Steubenville is no heaven on earth either.
No, oh goodness, no. Yeah, I'm not trying to glorify it as a great, the heaven on earth.
But it's like it's messy enough.
That's an example of like living in a general area where you can have enough of this of like-minded people.
Yeah. It's. I would prefer to have at least one neighbor who I was like within walking distance for my kids. So I'm talking like two, maybe even one house down. I would want one or two of those, and then the rest can be kind of spread out.
Yeah, I agree.
I want someone that my kids can walk out the front door past the age of 6 in a safe enough area where they can just go play with people.
Yeah.
And I can be out there and watch them, of course, but they have that opportunity.
Yeah, I agree.
Because that's what I'm concerned about the most, to be honest with you. Because there's something to be said about shielding your children from the world.
Yeah.
Because we had a meeting last week. We had Father Samuel Roth. Is that Father Stephen Roth, and he talked about masculinity, and he discussed how everything has been hypersexualized and men struggle with pornography a lot nowadays.
Yeah.
And that leads to the objectification of human beings, which is obviously just not healthy. Now, as a father, I think about how do I set up my kids to be successful when it comes to dealing with this temptation, this beast that everyone is dealing with. And I asked Father Roth, and he gave an excellent answer where, yes, you should set up parameters to protect your kids from these things, because you just watch the Super Bowl and there's going to at least be 5 commercials with hypersexualized images.
And the halftime shows nowadays
that too. But Father Roth also wanted to mention all that with caution, saying, okay, but don't completely shield your kids, because you need to give them an opportunity to cultivate virtue.
Correct. Yeah. And I think that's the best way to do it, because what we've seen throughout history and even in, I think my family to some extent had this problem, and I knew a bunch of people growing up who went through this, of their parents tried to like completely prevent them from encountering the world at all. And what usually happens is at some point that kid's going to be an adult or a teenager or both, and they're going to encounter the world. And if you didn't teach them how to interact with the world well, they're just going to go completely off to the other side in a certain sense. Like they're going to go like nuts. And like I've seen it happen where people tried to like quote unquote protect their kids, but they didn't teach them virtue. They didn't allow them to encounter the world at all. And so then they just grew up with no concept of it and did whatever they wanted when they got the chance. Yeah.
No, kids are good. And to be honest with you, I'm not sure if a sheltered kid is possible anymore, unless you're cut off.
Unless you live and phones and everything. Yeah.
Unless you live in the middle of nowhere and never give your kid access to the internet.
Yeah.
And there's an argument to be made for doing that to a certain extent. Okay. Like a 10-year-old should not be on the internet.
Oh gosh. I'm not even convinced
without
anyone under the age of 13 or 14 should be on the internet personally.
Without certain I think a kid can go on kids. I don't know. I'd have to think more about it, but you could see letting kid have access to a certain website somehow, like through an application, but everything else is safeguarded and locked. But kids are going to eventually get to the point where like, okay, everything's up in the air now. I can't protect you anymore. But you don't want to get to that point all of a sudden with the kid not having cultivated any virtue.
Which I think another aspect of this, though, of that conversation that I was talking with one of the other guys after that meeting that we had.
Yeah.
Is the aspect of making sure as a parent, and I know I'm not a parent right now, but this is something I've reflected on a lot from a lot of things I've heard and read and everything, is as long as you have that open communication with your kids too.
For sure.
Because to your point, I think it's like you have to, on some level, you have to allow them to have, like at some point, they're going to have access to some of those things, to some of the bad things even. Because no matter how much we try to prevent it, especially in the world we live in today, there's no way that kid's not going to at some point have access, unless you like cut yourself off from the world completely. And I don't think that's the right way to do it.
No, that's not good at all.
At some point, the kid's going to have access. And so part of that is about making sure that you keep a dialogue with your children as they're growing up, where they feel comfortable coming to you and saying like, hey, I encountered this thing, or I saw this thing, or this image, or, whatever. And you're able to have, like, you don't react in a way where it's like, oh my gosh, that's so awful. How could you have done that? Instead being like, yeah, like, this is one of the things that's out there. Like being able to have that open dialogue, I think is so valuable.
For sure.
And so important in that too.
So I think a good summary of what we've been talking about is, so there's community, this idea. What is community? Community is founded upon friendship, which is truly founded upon an appreciation for the good.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a disagreement on what is good, we would have to ask the question, is that final form of friendship even possible? And then is that final form of community even possible?
Yeah.
I think we could make a good argument. No, it's not.
Yes.
But the perfect form of community is not possible in this life. We've accepted that.
Yeah.
The perfect form of
Perfect,
community.
yeah, but
the
you
perfect
can still
form
have a very solid.
Right. The perfect form of community is in heaven.
Yes.
But we have to be careful and say that's not an excuse to just raise our hands in the air and be like, so what can we do? No, there is something we can do.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, not only hanging out with people who we love and love the same thing with, but also living even near them.
Yes.
And raising our families around them.
I agree.
Now, not completely cut off from the world, okay, because we're called to evangelize and preach the gospel, because these people are made in God's image and likeness and are worthy of hearing the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So we should not cut ourselves off from the world. We should also still go into the world, and not only for their sake, but also for the sake of our families.
Yep.
Because if you cut everyone off from the dangers of the world, they won't go on to be good people because they will not have been given the opportunity to be bad.
Yep.
Yeah. So, what do you have anything else to say? I mean, there's more things.
No, I think that's a great definition. I think that's a good kind of stopping point for this conversation. So yeah.
Good. Wonderful. Well, this is our second episode of Mountains and Men. That's gonna be weird saying our second episode of, because we're always gonna say of twice sometimes. Of Mountains and Men.
Well, you don't have to say our second episode. You could just say this has been of Mountains and Men.
This has been, there we see, Peter, I'm glad you're here, bud. This has been our second episode of This has been our second episode.
No, you keep saying second episode.
This has been of
you
Mountains and Men.
This has
there
been
we
of
go.
Mountains and Men. Yeah.
Get it together, Rhys. This has been of Mountains and Men. I'm Peter. Oh, I'm
Rhys.
There we go. Really, I'm Rhys.
And I'm Peter.
And you guys take care. God bless.